I endured years of humiliation. When I first met the Langley side of the family, it was at my husband Grant's father's second wedding, a sunburnt August afternoon, peach punch in plastic cups, and a string quartet awkwardly trying to play a hymn. Vivian Langley smiled with too many teeth and introduced herself as the one who keeps things tidy. She had a way of folding her fingers as if folding someone's life into an envelope. Her twin sons, Cole and Owen, both 30-something and allergic to work, hovered like decorative vultures. They were loud, opinionated, and practiced the art of entitlement like a ritual. Grant and I had been together since high school. He still flinched half a second when his mother, my stepmother-in-law by marriage, brushed past him in conversation, the old submissive reflex of a middle child born into a family that eats second helpings last. I kept my edge folded away because I wanted him to be okay. I wanted him to keep sleeping through the small earthquakes his family made. So I made choices. I wore thrift store dresses, I accepted help with our yard, I let jokes about my paycheck at the library slide off like drizzle. But my outward shape was deliberate camouflage. For a decade before I married Grant, I had worked county-side, in the dry, fluorescent-lit world of title examination and airship searches. The job taught me to read ink-stained margins like confessions, the way a clerk's scrawl could betray a missing clause, the way a rusted staple hinted a paper trail someone wanted buried. I specialized in archaic servitudes, the old easements, water rights, and municipal covenants that municipalities had long forgotten, but which still controlled who could build a driveway and who could shut off a well. Quiet things, legally powerful things. Somewhere between dusty ledgers and courthouse boxes, I became the named trustee for a sleepy instrument called the Old Mill Servitude Trust, a century-old covenant meant to preserve water access for a string of properties along the creek. No one thought much about it. I kept it that way because these instruments are dangerous. If someone knows a tool exists, they attempt to wield it. So I kept it hidden, and I kept helping neighbors fix title snags without advertising the one master key I held. At home, the Langleys treated me as a ledger void. Vivian would clap a hand on my shoulder and laugh about my little hobby, as if my late nights cataloging century-old liens were a Pinterest craft. Cole and Owen assumed any money I might have was either imaginary or owed to them by default. They sat on our new couch, our second-hand couch, and criticized the paint color like men accustomed to calling the tune in houses they didn't pay for. When Grant's mother found a wrinkle in a will or a scheduling oversight, she marched into our kitchen and demanded we do the right thing, which usually meant transferring yet another meaningless asset into their hands for safekeeping. They begged, suggested, and outright demanded. They told me that family mattered more than paperwork. They called me selfish when I refused to refinance our home to bail one of them out. They joked about my little trust in the same tone someone might joke about an old sock, unseen, worthless, and unhygienic to mention in polite company. I nodded, smiled, and kept the ledger of my real life in a safety deposit box under a second name. I answered calls late at night from elderly neighbors who needed a quiet title cleared. I filed quietus motions beneath the courthouse stairs. I let them belittle me because it was easier, and because if I ever showed my hand without the proper legal theater, someone would try to pry the key from my fingers. Nobody in the family thought to respect a ledger you couldn't see. The Langleys fixated on visible things, cars, clothes, a Facebook life of brunch photos. When the county announced a large public project, the Harrison Street utility mains upgrade, a big deal that would reroute the town's water infrastructure and land a lot of county contracts, the Langleys smelled publicity, and to them, money. Vivian wanted to be the face in every photo. Cole wanted to bid on the subcontracted landscaping. Owen wanted to get his fingers on a contractor's card. The problem was paperwork, real paperwork. Their house, owned for generations in Grant's family, had a dozen wrinkle lines. The old mill easement ran through the backyard, a remnant from the old tannery days, and the Langleys had built a shed and a garden that pinched that corridor. They knew superficially that a surviving but obscure trust might complicate things, but to them, complications were nuisances, not obstacles. The solution, like everything they do, was someone else signing something. The plan they forged was a work of greasy imagination. Barry Kent, their lawyer, a man who drank too much at club fundraisers and had a weakness for any quick fee, promised he could clean things up. They would convene a private probate equivalent at a tiny notary office 3 days before the county ribbon cutting. Barry would file an affidavit of lost instrument, alleging that the original trust paper was irretrievably lost and that the court should appoint a new trustee, one of Vivian's cousins she trusted. They intended to misrepresent Grant's family consent, forge a couple of signatures, and, while the county's attention was on the big project and the cameras, transfer the house deed into a shell company that Vivian controlled. Then, they would evict Grant and me and parlay the property into a quick flip. It was petty, grotesque stuff, conceived by people who believed only what they could see in Instagram highlights. They scheduled their little operation for a Tuesday morning, right before the big county event when the town hall would be too busy to scrutinize a last-minute filing. They didn't stop there. Cole and Owen, always theatrical, decided the humiliation should be public. They planned to present their new title at the county event, bring a printed summons for eviction to the town manager's tent, and parade our eviction in front of the civic cameras. It was the sort of ugly, performative cruelty they relished. To take the thing they had spent years mocking and tear it from me on the very stage where they wanted to be applauded. They consulted friends at the real estate office who owed them favors. Barry promised plausible deniability. Vivian smiled and bought new shoes. When they told Grant, they called him helpful, like he was a volunteer mascot. He did not fight with them. They had known him since boyhood, and he was afraid of the chaos that would come from opposing his family. They believed I was an easy mark. When Barry filed that affidavit of lost instrument, he made 2 mistakes. The first was assuming that a longtime title examiner would be unaware. The second was believing that old documents are simple things to erase. I found out at 3 a.m, like trues often arrive, because the county clerk's online filing alert pinged my personal monitoring feed. I wasn't supposed to have access to that feed, but years of neighborly favors, a retired clerk named Ruth who owed me coffee dates, and the quiet discipline of someone who reads other people's dust got me there. The affidavit was sloppy, wrong margin notes, a notary stamp dated with the wrong county code, a signature block that didn't match the style on the courthouse's archived copy. The affidavit tried to erase a century of covenant by alleging loss and simultaneous reissuance, a legal Frankenstein that could be defeated by proper chain of title scrutiny. I did not react with heat. I reacted with preparation. Revenge at scale doesn't need drama. It needs paperwork, witnesses, and precisely executed legal procedures. Step 1. Establish immediate public record. I filed aelis pendens against the property, not from a random attorney, but as the named trustee of the Old Mills Servitude Trust. I filed emergency notices that put any recorder on actual notice. This trust had been active, and an asserted loss required an evidentiary hearing. I attached to that lease pendens the scanned, certified copy of the trust instrument, signed, sealed, and deposited in my safety deposit under my maiden name, Eliza Carter, along with sworn affidavits from neighbors who had paid decades of rate assessments tied to that exact servitude. The instrument included a provision Barry didn't expect. In the event of any attempt to alter the trust without unanimous trustee consent, the trustee had the authority to immediately suspend water and sewer easements until a judicial remedy was sought. Step 2. Call in the bonds. The trust was old, but it carried attachments, historical indemnity bonds tied to environmental liabilities when the tannery closed. They were long dormant, but the trustee could demand immediate escrow of the bond if covenant violations threatened water access. I contacted the municipal bond registrar, produced the original trust certificate, and demanded immediate protective escrow for the bond covering the property linked to Vivian's claimed title. That move put a freeze on any transfer until the registrar and the county's council signed off. Step 3. Organize witnesses and optics. Public humiliation demands a stage, and if they wanted a stage, I would schedule the grandest one. I called Ellen Roth, the county mayor, and told her quietly that a manufactured title transfer was being staged and would be paraded at the Harrison Street event. Ellen is not theatrical by nature. She cares about the town's reputation. She agreed to attend in an official capacity and requested that the county council be present. I also called Sheriff Tom Daniels and said, "If anyone presents a doctored court paper at the event, I'd like them to have body cameras rolling." The sheriff was blunt and grateful. This was his kind of wrong. Step 4, make sure professional help was on record. I reached out to Anita Perez, the town clerk, and asked her to place a "Do Not Accept" code on any document bearing Barry Kent's signature without a court order. Anita, tired of bureaucratic theater herself, obliged. I also quietly told the local station, Channel 6, that the Langleys planned a public spectacle and asked for a legal correspondent to be on site. I didn't want cameras to gawk at me. I wanted cameras to witness the evidence. Everything was administrative and cold, my favorite kind of retribution. I spent 2 days drafting filings, signing affidavits under my trustee signature, and placing certified mail to every party involved. I hired an outside forensic document analyst to prepare a short, irrefutable report about the differences in signature style and paper stock in Barry's affidavit. I prepared a modest stack of printed certificates, the trust instrument, a ledger showing the bond, the chain of title tracing back to 1911, and the lice pendens in my name. Most importantly, I secured a quiet order from Judge Larkin, a temporary restraining order that would prevent any recording office from accepting changes related to the old mill servitude while the court sorted the matter. You cannot orchestrate public cruelty if a judicial finger says, "Wait." I did all this without telling Grant. He deserved the theater's revelation with dignity intact. He had been pushed into a corner emotionally by his family for so long. I wanted him to feel the rightness of being defended without feeling trapped into outrage on my behalf. Then I waited. The Langleys, busy buying ribbon-cutting hashtags and practicing their speeches, didn't notice the small changes placed like mousetraps on their path. Greed rings loud. It missed the hush of paperwork. The Harrison Street inauguration morning glittered with civic optimism, the mayor's tent, a string band playing oddly cheerful arrangements, tables of pastries that Bloomberg copywriters would call local charm. Vivian wore a sapphire dress that looked like it had swallowed too much sunlight. Cole and Owen had donned pressed shirts and the practiced air of sudden respectability. Barry Kent held a clipped stack of papers like a prop, his smile too wide for the room. I arrived late, on purpose, in a dress that said neighbor, not contractor. Grant walked beside me. He held my hand without knowing the scale of the storm. His hand fit mine the way it always had, a small anchor. They started their show. Cole strode to the mic and, with a theatrical sniff, announced a family decision and unspooled an allegedly new title conveyance. Owen unfurled a printed eviction notice and, with a flourish, tossed a folded copy toward the rows where our distant neighbors sat. Cameras turned. Barry Kent began a long, greasy explanation about clerical cleanup. I didn't move at first. I let the room hum with their arrogance. The sheriff's deputies were there in the crowd as a courtesy to the mayor, and the county council sat cross-armed beneath the tent. I felt the weight of all those eyes, and then, quietly, I reached into my bag. "Excuse me," I said into the microphone the mayor handed me. "If I may speak." There was a ripple of confusion. Vivian's smile thinned. Cole and Owen looked at each other as if wondering whether the script had included my interruption. "I am the trustee of the Old Mills Servitude Trust," I said. The words were plain. They landed like ledger entries. "This trust is on public record, and it contains a clause that requires unanimous consent before it may be altered. There is a lease pendens on record for the Langley property that prevents any transfer." I set a printed, certified copy on the lectern. I also have a temporary restraining order signed by Judge Larkin, preventing the recorder from accepting any purported transfer. Finally, I have filed with the municipal bond registrar demanding protective escrow for the environmental indemnity bond tied to the property. That bond is now in protective lock pending adjudication." The band stopped. It sounds dramatic, and yet it was simply the legal equivalent of flipping a power switch. A hush spread like a winter breath. A Channel 6 camera panned in. The reporter, mid-sip of coffee, dropped her cup and looked straight into the sudden story. Mayor Ellen Roth stood up, face pinched, and asked to see my certified filings. Cole laughed first, nerve cracking like a brittle twig. "You have a piece of paper," he sneered. "You can't stop the county, Eliza. You aren't even—" "Not even what?" I asked. "A quiet title specialist? The sworn trustee for a public servitude? The person with certified established authority to demand bond escrow when a covenant is threatened?" The words were clinical, surgical. I slid the forensic analyst's report to the mayor. I showed the county council the differences in ink and date stamps on Barry's affidavit. I placed under the camera a certified copy of the Elias pendants, highlighted in yellow where the county registrar must withhold any new entries. The sheriff's deputy, who had been a neighbor of mine for years and once borrowed sugar from our kitchen, walked across the grass and set a hand flat on Barry Kent's stack of papers. "These are not court orders," he said slowly, "and until the county council clears these things, we aren't executing any change of possession." Vivian's face only then began to show a fracture. "You can't," she started, and then her voice broke. She had expected a different reaction. Not a county council with a legal feed in her inbox, not a registrar on the phone confirming an escrow, and certainly not a reporter about to live stream the entire humiliation. Cole grabbed a microphone and attempted to shout over me. "This is our family, our history. This is not your history," I said, and I did something I had prepared for but had never rehearsed on anyone I knew. I read aloud a clause from the trust. The clause, crisp and archaic, said that any attempt to modify the servitude without trustee consent would allow the trustee to suspend the easement and call the indemnity bond to protect the county's waterways and maintain the trust's purposes. That very clause, when read into the public record, triggered the registrar to confirm the protective escrow. There were consequences that unfolded like dominoes. The county council called her office and confirmed the restrained recording. The registrar placed the bond on alert. The town clerk flagged Barry Kent's signature for further review. The reporter's camera found Vivian's blue dress and stopped on Cole's face, red, then paler. People in the crowd, neighbors, contractors, the mayor's social circle, murmured. Someone in the back whispered the very word the Langleys feared: forgery. Barry sputtered. "You can't freeze bank transfers with a trust paper," he blustered. "Not bank transfers," I corrected calmly. "But I can, as trustee, demand escrow that prevents a clear title until there is judicial resolution, and any attempt to transfer in defiance of that will trigger enforcement." And, I added, watching a different, quieter chain reaction begin, "I have already filed criminal referrals for the affidavit discrepancies, and the forensic analyst is prepared to testify." Within the hour, Sheriff Daniels had 2 deputies in the Langley tent politely asking for Barry's ID while an officer from the county prosecutor's office took a statement about a possible forged affidavit. The county council whispered across to the mayor, this was not how they'd wanted their ribbon cutting to go. Vivian went white and dropped her printed copy of the new title. Cole and Owen toggled between outrage and the dawning comprehension that public life is a world where legal technicalities can snuff out reputation like water. They begged at first, not to me directly, but to the public. "We didn't know," Vivian said, tears pricking. "It's just paperwork." But the cameras had the signatures, the dates, the forensic report. Barry's phone began to die under a sudden barrage of calls from his bar buddies who were suddenly not sure they wanted connection to a potential felony. one of Barry's associates who had earlier told Owen where to order cheap printed affidavits, asked to be excused. The final act was quiet. A deputy handed Vivian a county summons to appear for questioning about the affidavit. The crowd watched two men with expensive shoes being told their legal gambit had been stopped by a woman they had mocked for years. The taste of it was cold and clean. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I filed the restraining order with a steady pen, signed another affidavit, and walked away. On the sidewalk, Grant squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, stunned. "You don't need to be," I said. "You need to come home." The week after the inauguration moved like slow, careful paperwork. The prosecutor's office confirmed that Victor Barry Kent, as the press started to call him in whispers, was under investigation for submitting a knowingly false affidavit. The county registry refused to accept any transfer tied to the Old Mill corridor, and the bond remained under protective escrow. Quietly, the town's contractor community reached out to me, an odd mixture of gratitude and awe. The Langleys tried a reprise. Vivian wrote a teary, performative letter to the local paper, claimed stress, and begged for reconciliation. Cole and Owen called Grant from blocked numbers, alternating between apologies and threats, terrible, childish things like, "We can make your life hard," which only confirmed to me the scale of their desperation. They came to our door once, 2 days later, dripping apologies that reeked of entitlement and cheap cologne. Owen placed a bouquet on our porch like an offering. It was a vase of dead hydrangeas and a banker's smile. I felt something then I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but an odd, precise sorrow. These were people I had allowed to live in my house with their laughter, people who had eaten on my table. They had mistaken laughter for permission. When Vivian tried to hug Grant, he stepped aside. He had watched me do the thing he was always too gentle to choose, and he had learned quietly the value of someone who would not let their life be stolen. They begged. They cried. They called every aunt, cousin, and friend who might whisper in the county council's ear, but the law moved like a glacier. Documents, once filed, have momentum. The bond could not be released without a court hearing. Barry lost clients. He lost his standing at the Bar Association's charity golf event. In the weeks that followed, he accepted a quiet suspension while the matter was investigated. I did not throw their keys in the creek. I breathed and decided what to rebuild. The house stayed ours. The servitude remained in effect for the creek and for neighbors who needed it. But I removed my name from the decorative gift list the Langleys had kept. I stopped offering them help with forms for free. When a cousin called and asked me to do a quick thing, I said no and explained plainly that my time was mine. I took one deliberate kindness. I transferred the management of the Old Mill Servitude Trust into a small local community land trust, an organization focused on preserving access and preventing any one family from weaponizing those covenants again. The transfer wasn't to enrich me. It was to neuter the Langleys' sense that they could ever use legal paper to humiliate our neighbors. The town applauded. Some called it theatrical. Some said I had been soft. But the thing about real peace, it doesn't require headlines. Grant and I sat on our secondhand couch one evening after the dust settled. He made coffee in a chipped pot we had had when we moved in. The house smelled like onion and cedar and the faint soot of an old furnace. He reached across the coffee table and said, "You saved us." I looked at him and felt for the first time in years like someone had finally laid down a book on a table and said, "Read this later," not "do my chapter for me." I answered, "We saved us, together." The Langleys would rebuild in their own way, maybe with new pranks, with new schemes, with the same loud laughter at other people's edges. There are always people who think a little cruelty is currency, but I had taken the ledger out of hiding and used it to protect a stream, some neighbor's driveway, and our dignity. The county's water ran that winter exactly where it should, the way paper and ink and a small, obscure trust had always intended. To the woman who feels ignored at the family table, to the daughter-in-law whose jokes about no savings sting, I say this. There is strength in quiet knowledge. There are instruments in the world that look like dust, but are really very heavy keys. You can learn them. You can protect yourself. The point is not to become cruel in return. It is to become capable. To do what is necessary, quietly, precisely, and then live in the peace that follows. If you liked this story, let me know where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity is not loud. Sometimes it is a paper filed at 3 a.m. with a trembling hand and a steady heart. Quiet dinners where they left me a single roll, sarcastic, helpful notes tacked to my mirror, and open sneers about my non-existent savings. But the day they thought I was vulnerable, they stabbed me in the back by staging a fake probate emergency and trying to seize my home with forged paperwork. I let them laugh until the night before the county's public utility inauguration. Then I moved the pieces into place. They believed I was a meek, penniless daughter-in-law, but I had been the quiet steward of an old county servitude trust for a decade, and I would show them what being powerless looks like, with the power turned against them. My name is Eliza Monroe, and I am 33 years old. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get what they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the cracked porch where it all began.